Hi, I'm Marci Kobayashi, and I'm back again with another excerpt from my book, Finding Yoyu. If you're not familiar with the term Yoyu, it's Japanese, and we use it when we talk about our wherewithal or capacity or bandwidth. So, for example, you would say, you would use it if you're talking about whether you have enough time or enough money or energy, or you don't have enough time or money or energy or anything like that. And I'll put a link up to another video that talks about how I came to understand the term yo-yo. I chose it for the title of my book because there was a year when I needed a lot of yo-yo, or I needed to manage my yo-yo because I was taking care of my mother-in-law, who was preparing for end of life and moving into a nursing home, and my father-in-law, who we discovered had Alzheimer's, and my husband, who had discovered he had stage 3 colon cancer and chose chemo-free recovery from cancer. And so I needed a lot of yo-yo, and I needed a lot of energy and time and oomph to get through that. And some days I had it, and some days I wasn't very good at managing my yo-yo. So, for example, if you've been following along in the last excerpt, I talked about how I ran out of energy. I didn't have any yo-yo, and I needed to get some help from a lot of plants and trees on the walk home from the hospital after my husband had surgery. Well, today we're going to pick up from there, and I will jump right in. Here we go. The day after Akira's surgery, I tried to sleep in, but woke up early anyway. Akira had already texted me, so I knew that he had been moved out of ICU and was now back in his own room. Anxious to see him, I packed a lunch and prepared for another long day. I was careful not to stay too late. On my way home that night, I mentally waved at all the plants and trees that had helped me home the night before. When I got to the hospital the next morning, Akira seemed weaker. It didn't make sense. His doctor had assured me that the surgery was successful, so I couldn't understand why Akira looked like a wax doll, white and pasty, 2 days later. He was still losing a lot of blood through the drain tube and bowel movements. Throughout the day, he got weaker and weaker, and though I asked, no one seemed concerned. By the time our good friends Shige and Maki came to visit in the evening, I was tired, and Akira's weakened state no longer seemed unusual. I thought it was funny when he started chattering about the PowerPoint presentation he said he could see on the ceiling. All I could do was roll my eyes and laugh. Akira was being silly. Fortunately, Maki had more yo-yo or wherewithal than I did. She asked the nurse if it was normal that Akira's fever was so high and that his drain bag needed to be emptied so often. The nurse had just started her shift. She gave us a strange look and stopped to review Akira's chart. She paused, told us she would be right back, and left immediately without checking the 3 other patients in the room. Then, as promised, she came right back and pricked Akira's finger. His hemoglobin count was 6.9. It didn't mean much to me, but I knew it must be a concern because she left again, saying she would be back after talking with the surgeon. I knew she meant calling the surgeon at home. During his Friday afternoon rounds the day before, the surgeon told us we wouldn't see him again until Monday morning because he was taking the weekend off to golf. The nurse came back minutes later. The surgeon had told her to start a blood transfusion immediately. I was surprised and relieved. Finally, someone was really looking at Akira. I waited until Akira fell asleep and then left together with Shige and Maki to have dinner. I shared with them about the essiac tea Akira had started taking before surgery and our switch to a plant-based diet. We also talked about energy healing and other options to support Akira's recovery. Though I had been buoyed by our conversation, I still had a seed of worry in my stomach. Why did Akira need a blood transfusion? I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, worrying about Akira. The next morning, Sunday morning, I left home early and got to the hospital before visiting hours. I was surprised to see the surgeon when I arrived. He had forfeited his golf weekend. That's when I really started to worry. Though Akira was looking better since starting the blood transfusion, the surgeon wasn't sure why Akira was still losing blood. Everything around the incision on the outside looked beautiful, and the CT scan confirmed the same on the inside. The area where the surgeon had removed the tumor and lymph node was fine. Since the main surgery had been fine, the surgeon guessed that Akira was bleeding in the area around where one of the benign polyps had been removed the night before surgery. One of them had been quite large and difficult to reach. If Akira didn't stop bleeding, they would have to open him up again for a second surgery because there was no other way to reach that part of his colon. They couldn't go in rectally without disturbing the area around where the tumor had been. The surgeon ordered another CT scan. Then he came back later in the afternoon to make sure I would be available the following morning for a meeting to review Akira's case and schedule the surgery. He recommended that I ask another family member to be there as well. I was stunned. There was no way I wanted them to open up Akira again. Part of me felt sick to my stomach with guilt, too. I thought back to the night before the main surgery and wondered if the surgeon had been distracted when I passed out. Logic told me that Mom was right and that I had passed out watching the doctor remove the polyps because I had forgotten to breathe. Still, I secretly wondered if I had passed out as a warning that something was seriously wrong. But that was crazy thinking because at this point, it didn't matter either way. What mattered was stopping the bleeding now. Akira slept most of the day while the blood transfusion continued. I stayed there watching over him. I waited until after the shift changed and the evening nurse had made the rounds. Then I closed the curtain around his part of the room. The overhead light had been dimmed and the lamp on his bedstand gave off a warm, orangish-yellow light. I stood next to Akira with my right hand over the top of his head and my left hand over his belly. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath and opened an energy healing session, calling in every spirit guide I could think of. I immediately received a clear impression of needs stitching and an assurance that it would be taken care of. A few seconds later, I felt clear-headed and my eyes opened naturally. I looked around. Thinking I hadn't given the session enough time, I started muscle testing, used the O-ring method to ask if I should continue, and got the answer no. I kept asking things such as, should I keep sending Akira energy? Should I keep the connection open with my guides? Every answer came back no. I closed the healing session and just sat with Akira. The nurses didn't bother me, even though visiting hours were over. Monday morning, the next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. I had slept deeply and headed for the hospital without feeling rushed or anxious. At the intersection in front of the hospital, I waited for the light to change so I could cross the street. It was a busy intersection, especially with all the Monday morning traffic. In the 2 to 3 seconds while one light turned red and before the other turned green, I watched a butterfly fly into the middle. Those 2 to 3 seconds lasted an extra long time. I looked around, wondering if anyone else was watching the butterfly. When I looked back again, the butterfly was gone and the light was green. I crossed the street and entered the hospital. A few minutes later, I was meeting with the surgeon. He reviewed all of the tests that had been taken the day before. He also explained the risks of the second surgery and why it was the only way to reach the area where Akira was still bleeding. He finished by saying that Akira was looking better this morning. They had started giving him a blood coagulant and perhaps it was working. He wanted to take another scan before scheduling the second surgery. After the meeting, Akira was immediately wheeled away for another CT scan. Before lunch, the surgeon returned to let us know that the spot where Akira was bleeding out was now minuscule compared with the day before. He and the nurses would continue to monitor Akira, but for now, the surgeon no longer felt a need for a second surgery. Yes! After the surgeon left the room, I told Akira about the energy work I had done the night before. I wondered whether the energy work was what helped him. Perhaps the blood coagulant was responsible. Or, perhaps, given 4 bags of blood, Akira's body felt revitalized enough to do what it knows how to do on its own. Or maybe Akira's turnaround was thanks to the nurse who acted quickly after my friend Maki questioned Akira's condition. More likely, it was a combination of all of the above. I didn't really care. I was grateful Akira had his color back and started counting the days until I could get him out of there. I no longer had faith in the hospital. Okay, that is all for today. And I know I just said that I no longer had faith in the hospital, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm in no place to judge, but I do want to say that I'm very grateful to the surgeon for removing the polyps and removing the tumor and the lymph node, and I'm very grateful to the nurses for taking care of him, and especially the one who acted so quickly. But that event and some of the things and the comments the surgeon made in the following days opened a window for doubt, and it continued to grow. And I'll share more about that in the next excerpt. But I just wanted to say that I don't doubt the power and need for conventional interventions, but I also appreciate energy work and what it can do to complement our health and recovery. So that's all for now. I'll be back again next week.